The gunshot that killed her father echoed through the valley just as dawn broke over the Wyoming territory, and 20-year-old Sarah Mitchell knew in that moment her life would never be the same. She dropped the bucket of water she had been carrying from the well, the liquid spilling across the dry earth as she ran toward the house. Her bare feet kicked up dust, her nightdress catching on the rough sagebrush that dotted their small homestead. The door hung open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze, and inside she found her father slumped over the kitchen table, blood pooling beneath his weathered hands. The sheriff would later say it was a robbery gone wrong, that drifters had been spotted heading south toward Cheyenne, but Sarah knew the truth ran deeper. Her father had owed money to men who did not forgive debts. The funeral was small, attended by only a handful of neighbors who could spare the time during the busy season of 1878. Sarah stood beside the grave with dirt under her fingernails and her mother's old shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the only nice thing she owned. The preacher spoke words that seemed to float away on the wind, meaningless against the weight of her new reality. At 20 years old, she was alone with a failing ranch, 3 horses that were too old to sell for much, and a mortgage that came due in 3 months. After the last mourner left, Sarah walked back to the house and stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror that hung beside the door. Her face was sunburned and lean, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that made her look older than her years. But it was her hands that drew her attention, calloused and rough, the nails broken and rimmed with dirt that never quite washed away. These were not the hands of the girl she had once been, the one who had dreamed of pretty dresses and dance halls. These were the hands of someone who had learned to survive. The next morning, Sarah rose before the sun and began the work that would define her days for months to come. She mended fences that had fallen into disrepair, her fingers bleeding as she twisted the wire into place. She mucked out the stables and hauled water from the well until her shoulders ached. She rode out to check on the small herd of cattle her father had managed to keep, counting each head and praying none would wander off or fall prey to wolves. Every task left new marks on her hands, new calluses layering over old ones, her skin growing tougher even as something inside her threatened to break. The townspeople of Sweetwater Creek watched her struggle with a mixture of pity and disapproval. Women whispered behind their hands at the general store, saying it was not proper for a young woman to be living alone, doing man's work. The men offered advice she had not asked for, telling her to sell the ranch and find a husband, as if either option were simple. Sarah ignored them all, her jaw set with determination that bordered on stubbornness. She would save her father's ranch, or she would die trying. 6 weeks after her father's death, Sarah stood in the barn trying to repair a broken harness when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. She set down her tools and walked to the door, shielding her eyes against the afternoon sun. A lone rider was coming up the path, sitting tall in the saddle on a gray mare that moved with the easy grace of a well-trained animal. As he drew closer, Sarah could make out more details. A black hat pulled low, a blue shirt faded from many washings, and a face that was both handsome and weathered by sun and wind. The rider stopped a respectful distance from the barn and dismounted, holding the reins loosely in one hand. He was tall, probably in his mid-20s, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of creek water in summer. There was a quiet confidence in the way he moved, the easy stance of someone comfortable in his own skin. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Name is James Cordell. I heard in town you might be looking for a ranch hand." Sarah felt her spine stiffen. She had not been looking for help, could not afford it even if she wanted it. "You heard wrong," she said, her voice flat. "I am managing fine on my own." James looked around the property with an assessing eye that somehow did not feel judgmental. He took in the sagging fence posts, the barn door hanging crooked on its hinges, the weeds growing tall around the foundation of the house. When his gaze returned to her, there was something gentle in it that made Sarah want to look away. I can see you have been working hard, he said quietly, but this is a lot of ranch for one person to handle alone. I do not have money to pay a hand, Sarah said bluntly. She was too tired for pride, too worn down to pretend otherwise. So unless you are working for free, you are wasting your time. I am not asking for wages, James said. Just food and a place to sleep. I have been drifting for a while now and I could use some honest work. Sarah studied him suspiciously. In her experience, men did not offer something for nothing. There was always a catch, always an angle. Why would you work for no pay? James was quiet for a moment, his fingers running along the leather reins. My sister was widowed last year, he finally said. Left with 2 small children and a farm she could not manage. Neighbors helped her, asked for nothing in return. I figure it is time I paid that kindness forward. There was truth in his voice, a sincerity that Sarah wanted desperately to believe even as caution held her back. She looked down at her hands, at the fresh blisters that had formed that morning while she tried to fix the porch steps. She thought of all the work that still needed doing, the long list that grew faster than she could check items off. She thought of the mortgage payment looming like a thundercloud on the horizon. Barn has a loft, she heard herself say. It is not much, but it is dry. I can offer 2 meals a day and you are welcome to bathe in the creek. James smiled and it transformed his whole face, made him look younger and lighter. That is more than fair, ma'am. Sarah, she said. My name is Sarah Mitchell. Pleased to meet you, Sarah. The way he said her name, with a softness that felt almost like respect, made something flutter in her chest that she quickly pushed down. James moved into the barn that afternoon, settling his few belongings in the loft with an efficiency that spoke of a man used to traveling light. Sarah watched him from the house, still not quite believing she had agreed to this arrangement, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. But as the day faded into evening and she prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread, James appeared at the door with an armful of firewood he had split without being asked. Noticed your woodpile was getting low, he said, stacking it neatly beside the stove. Sarah nodded her thanks, not trusting herself to speak. She was not used to help, not used to someone noticing what needed doing and simply doing it. They ate in near silence, the scrape of spoons against tin plates the only sound. But it was not an uncomfortable silence, Sarah realized. It was the quiet of 2 people too tired for small talk, too focused on the sustenance in front of them to bother with pleasantries. After supper, James excused himself and returned to the barn. Sarah cleaned the dishes and sat alone in the gathering darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling in for the night. For the first time since her father's death, she felt something that might have been hope. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of hammering. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to find James already at work on the barn door, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. He had the door off its hinges and was planing down the edge that had been sticking, his movements sure and practiced. You are up early, Sarah called out. James looked up and smiled. Habit. My father always said the best work gets done before the heat of the day. Sarah felt a pang at the mention of fathers, but she pushed it aside. I was planning to check the north fence line today. Some of the posts are rotting and need replacing. I can handle that, James offered. Unless you would rather I work on something else, Sarah hesitated. She was used to doing everything herself, used to not depending on anyone. But she also recognized the foolishness of refusing help when it was freely given. The fence would be good, she said. I need to ride into town for supplies anyway. It was a lie, she realized as soon as she said it. She had no money for supplies, no real reason to go to town except to avoid spending the day working alongside James. There was something about his presence that unsettled her, made her aware of herself in a way she had not been in months. She did not like the feeling, did not have time for whatever it might mean. Sarah saddled her father's old gelding and rode toward Sweetwater Creek, the morning sun already promising another hot day. The town was small, just a main street with a handful of buildings. The general store, the saloon, the hotel, the church, and the sheriff's office. Sarah tied her horse outside the store and stood for a moment on the wooden sidewalk, watching the town come to life around her. Sarah Mitchell, as I live and breathe. Sarah turned to find Alina Pritchard, the banker's wife, approaching with a basket over her arm and a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Alina was everything Sarah was not, soft and pretty, with smooth hands and a dress that probably cost more than Sarah's entire wardrobe. "Mrs. Pritchard," Sarah said politely. "I heard you hired a ranch hand," Alina said, her voice pitched just loud enough that passers-by could hear. "Is that wise, a young woman alone with a strange man?" Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice level. "Mr. Cordell is helping with repairs in exchange for room and board. It is a perfectly respectable arrangement." "Of course," Alina said, though her tone suggested she thought otherwise. "I am sure you know what you are doing, though if you ever decide to sell the ranch, my husband knows several interested buyers." "I am not selling," Sarah said firmly. Alina's smile tightened. "Of course not." "Well, good day, Sarah. Do take care of yourself out there." Sarah watched her walk away, anger simmering in her gut. She knew what people like Alina thought of her, knew they were waiting for her to fail so they could swoop in and buy her land for pennies on the dollar. The thought made her more determined than ever to succeed. She returned to the ranch to find James had not only repaired the barn door but had also fixed the porch steps and was working on the corral fence. He moved with a steady rhythm, his focus complete, and Sarah found herself pausing to watch him work. There was something compelling about his competence, the way he seemed to know instinctively what needed doing and how to do it right. "You have been busy," she said, announcing her presence. James straightened and wiped sweat from his brow. "Place is starting to shape up. You have good bones here, Sarah, just needs some attention." "My father built most of it himself," Sarah said, surprised by the sudden tightness in her throat. "He was a good man, did not deserve what happened to him." James set down his hammer and looked at her with those calm, steady eyes. "No one deserves that," he said quietly. "I am sorry for your loss." The simple sincerity of his words cracked something open inside Sarah, and she felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back furiously, angry at herself for showing weakness. "I should start supper," she said abruptly, turning toward the house. "Sarah." James's voice stopped her. She looked back, and he was watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "You do not always have to be so strong, you know. It is all right to let someone help carry the weight sometimes." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she was fine, that she did not need anyone's pity or help. But the words stuck in her throat, and instead she just nodded and fled into the house. That night, as she prepared beans and salt pork, Sarah thought about what James had said. She had spent so long being strong, being tough, building walls around herself to keep out the pain and fear and loneliness. The idea of letting those walls down, even a little, terrified her more than anything. Over the following weeks, a routine developed between them. James worked on the ranch from sunup to sundown, tackling projects Sarah had not had the time or skill to address. He repaired the roof, replaced rotten fence posts, cleaned out the irrigation ditches that fed their small vegetable garden. Sarah worked alongside him when she could, learning from watching him, her respect for his abilities growing with each passing day. They talked while they worked, small conversations at first, gradually growing deeper. James told her about growing up on a ranch in Colorado, about his parents who had died in a fire when he was 19. About the years he had spent drifting from job to job, never quite finding a place that felt like home. Sarah talked about her father, about her mother who had died when Sarah was 12, about the dreams she had once had that seemed foolish now in the harsh light of reality. "What did you dream about?" James asked one afternoon as they worked together to move a pile of rocks that had been dumped in the middle of the pasture. Sarah lifted a heavy stone and tossed it aside, feeling the familiar burn in her shoulders. "Silly things," she said. "I wanted to see the ocean." I read about it in a book once, about how it stretches on forever and the water is salt and blue as the sky. Seems impossible, does it not? That much water in one place. I saw it once, James said. Went to California when I was 21. Worked on a ranch near Monterey for a few months. Sarah stopped working and stared at him. What was it like? James smiled at her obvious interest. It was everything you imagine and more. The sound of the waves is like nothing else, constant and powerful. And the smell of the salt air, the way the light hits the water at sunset. It is something that stays with you. I cannot imagine ever going that far, Sarah said, returning to work. Cannot imagine leaving this place even if it is hard. Maybe someday, James said, when the ranch is on solid footing, when you have help you can trust to run it for a while. No dream is too silly, Sarah. The world is bigger than this valley, and you deserve to see some of it. His words stayed with her long after they had finished for the day, warming something cold inside her that had been frozen for so long she had forgotten it was there. As summer deepened, the work began to pay off. The ranch started to look cared for again, the fences solid, the buildings sound. The cattle grew fat on good grass, and Sarah began to hope that maybe, just maybe, she could make the mortgage payment when it came due. But hope was a dangerous thing, she reminded herself. Hope could break your heart worse than any loss. One evening, as they sat on the porch after supper watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, James turned to her with a serious expression. Sarah, I need to tell you something. Her stomach clenched with sudden fear. This was it, she thought. This was where he told her he was leaving, that he had stayed long enough, that it was time to move on. What is it? I know you are worried about the mortgage payment, James said carefully. And I want you to know I have some money saved. Not a lot, but enough to help if you come up short. Sarah felt a rush of emotions so intense she could barely breathe. Gratitude, shame, anger, fear, all tangled together until she could not separate one from another. I cannot take your money, she said, her voice tight. It is not charity, James said quickly. Think of it as an investment. I believe in what you are doing here, Sarah. I believe in you. Why? The word burst out of her, raw and desperate. Why do you care what happens to me or this ranch? You barely know me. James was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear. I care because I have spent 3 years drifting, looking for something I could not name. And then I came here, and for the first time since I lost my parents, I felt like I had found a place I could call home, not because of the land or the work, but because of you. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. James. You do not have to say anything, he said, looking at her now with eyes that held a vulnerability she had not seen before. I just needed you to know. I am here because I want to be, because every day I get to watch you fight for this place, I see the bravest person I have ever known. I am not brave, Sarah whispered. I am terrified all the time. James reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. When she did not move, he took her hand in his thumb brushing over her knuckles, over the calluses and scars and rough skin. These hands, he said quietly, they tell a story of courage, of someone who did not give up when it would have been easier to walk away. You worked until your hands bled, until your body ached, and you kept going. If that is not bravery, I do not know what is. Sarah looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between his tanned, work-roughened skin and her own. She wanted to believe him, wanted to see herself through his eyes. They are just hands, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. James lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Not just hands, he said. Brave hands, hands that built a life when everything fell apart. He kissed her palm, then each finger in turn, his lips warm and soft against her skin. The bravest hands I have ever had the privilege to hold. Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks, all the emotion she had been holding back for months finally breaking free. James pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, pressing her face against his shoulder and letting herself cry for the first time since her father's funeral. He held her as the sun set and the stars came out, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring soft words of comfort that she felt more than heard. When her tears finally subsided, Sarah pulled back slightly to look at him. His face was close to hers, his eyes searching. "I am a mess," she said with a shaky laugh. "You are beautiful," James said, and there was such honesty in his voice that Sarah felt her breath catch. "You have been beautiful since the moment I first saw you standing in that barn doorway, covered in dust and determination." "James," Sarah breathed, and then his lips were on hers, gentle and questioning. She kissed him back, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, anchoring herself against the rush of feeling that threatened to sweep her away. The kiss deepened, and Sarah felt something inside her unfold like a flower turning toward the sun. This was what she had been missing, she realized. Not just help with the ranch, but this connection, this feeling of being truly seen and valued. They broke apart slowly, both breathing hard. James rested his forehead against hers, his hands cupping her face with a tenderness that made her want to cry all over again. "I did not plan on that," he admitted with a soft laugh. "Neither did I," Sarah said, but she was smiling, really smiling, for the first time in what felt like forever. "Sarah Mitchell, I think I am falling in love with you," James said, his voice serious now. "And I need you to know that I am not going anywhere. Whatever happens with the ranch, whatever struggles come, I want to face them with you, if you will have me." Sarah thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, closed off and afraid, determined to handle everything alone. She thought about the woman she was becoming, learning slowly that accepting help was not weakness, that letting someone in did not mean losing yourself. She thought about James, who had appeared when she needed him most and stayed not because he owed her anything, but because he chose to. "I think I am falling in love with you too," she whispered, and watched his face light up with joy. "And yes, I will have you, I want you to stay." James kissed her again, deeper this time, and Sarah let herself get lost in it, in the feeling of his arms around her and the solid warmth of his body against hers. When they finally pulled apart, the night had grown full dark around them, and the air was rich with the smell of sage and earth. "We should probably get some sleep," James said reluctantly. "Big day tomorrow." Sarah nodded, though part of her wanted to stay right here on this porch with him forever, holding on to this perfect moment. "Big day," she echoed. James stood and helped her to her feet, keeping hold of her hand. "Good night, Sarah." "Good night," she said, and watched him walk toward the barn, his figure disappearing into the shadows. She stood there for a long time, her fingers touching her lips where he had kissed her, before finally going inside. Sleep did not come easily that night. Sarah lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the evening in her mind. She felt scared and excited in equal measure, terrified of this new vulnerability but also exhilarated by it. James loved her. She loved him. It seemed both impossible and inevitable, like it had been written in the stars long before either of them knew it. The next morning, Sarah woke to find James already up and working, but there was a new lightness to him, a joy that had not been there before. He smiled at her over breakfast, and she smiled back, both of them shy and pleased. The work of the day stretched ahead, but it felt different now, like a shared adventure rather than a burden to be endured. They worked side by side, falling into an easy rhythm that felt natural. James taught Sarah how to properly shoe a horse, patiently guiding her hands as she held the nails and learned to tap them in at just the right angle. His hands covered hers, strong and sure, and Sarah felt heat spread through her that had nothing to do with the summer sun. "You are a good teacher," she said, concentrating on keeping the nail straight. "You are a good student," James replied. "Quick to learn, not afraid of hard work. That is a rare combination." "I have had to be," Sarah said. "There was no one else to do it." "Well, you have someone now," James said softly. "You have me for as long as you want me." Sarah looked up at him, at his earnest face and warm eyes. "Forever," she said, surprising herself with the word. "I want you forever." James's smile was brilliant. "Forever it is, then." They sealed the promise with a kiss, there in the dusty stable with the horse stamping impatiently beside them, and Sarah thought she had never been happier. The weeks rolled by in a blur of hard work and growing love. James and Sarah became inseparable, working together during the day and spending their evenings on the porch, talking and laughing and stealing kisses when the mood struck. Sarah learned the feel of his hands on her waist, the sound of his laugh, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. James learned her stubborn pride, her fierce determination, the soft heart she tried so hard to hide. One afternoon, as they worked to clear brush from the creek bed, James suddenly straightened and looked at her with an expression that made her heart skip. "Sarah, I want to marry you." It was not a question, but Sarah treated it like one anyway. "Are you asking me?" James set down his tools and came to her, taking both her hands in his. "Sarah Mitchell, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? I know we have not known each other long, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, and I want to spend every day I have left on this earth by your side." Sarah felt tears well up, but these were happy tears, tears of joy and relief and overwhelming love. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, I will marry you." James whooped with happiness and lifted her off her feet, spinning her around until she was laughing and dizzy. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, his hands tangled in her hair, and Sarah kissed him back with all the passion she had been holding in check. "When?" she asked breathlessly when they finally broke apart. "As soon as possible," James said. "Tomorrow, if we can manage it. I do not want to wait another day to call you my wife." They rode into town the next morning, dressed in their best clothes, which admittedly were not much. Sarah wore the same dress she had worn to her father's funeral, the nicest thing she owned, and James had on a clean shirt and his best pants. They went straight to the church and found the preacher, a kind old man named Reverend Hartley who had known Sarah since she was a child. "Sarah Mitchell," he said with surprise. "What brings you to town today?" "We want to get married," Sarah said, holding tight to James's hand. "Today, if possible." Reverend Hartley looked between them, taking in their clasped hands and obvious devotion. "I see, and how long have you two been acquainted?" 2 months, James said. "I know it is not long, but I love her, Reverend, and she loves me. We do not see any reason to wait." The Reverend smiled gently. "Love is a gift from God, not to be taken lightly, but I see it in both your faces, plain as day. Very well, I will marry you. Do you have witnesses?" They found 2 willing witnesses at the general store, an older couple who were friends of Sarah's father. Within the hour, Sarah and James stood before the altar, speaking their vows with clear voices and full hearts. James slipped a simple gold band onto Sarah's finger, one he had bought in town weeks ago in hopeful anticipation of this moment. Sarah had no ring for him, but he did not seem to mind, too busy smiling at her like she had hung the moon. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Hartley said. "You may kiss your bride." James cupped Sarah's face in his hands and kissed her sweetly, reverently, as if she were something precious and fragile. Sarah kissed him back, feeling a sense of rightness settle over her like a warm blanket. This was where she was meant to be, standing beside this man, beginning a new chapter of her life. They left the church as husband and wife, stepping out into the bright afternoon sunshine. Eleanor Pritchard was walking past and stopped short at the sight of them, her eyes widening as she took in their joined hands and happy faces. "Mrs. Pritchard," Sarah said, unable to keep the satisfaction out of her voice. "I would like you to meet my husband, James Cordell." Eleanor's mouth opened and closed like a fish. "You got married. When?" "Just now," James said cheerfully. "Beautiful ceremony, was it not, darling?" "Beautiful," Sarah agreed, smiling up at him. They left Eleanor standing on the sidewalk, her expression still one of shock, and rode back to the ranch. Sarah felt light, almost giddy with happiness. She was married. She had a partner, someone to stand beside her through whatever came next. The future suddenly seemed full of possibility instead of dread. That night, for the first time, James did not sleep in the barn. He moved his belongings into the house, into Sarah's room, and they lay together in the narrow bed, wrapped in each other's arms. James held her close, his lips pressed to her forehead, and Sarah felt safe in a way she had not since her father died. "I love you, Mrs. Cordell," James whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Sarah whispered back, and fell asleep with a smile on her face. The mortgage payment came due 3 weeks after their wedding. Sarah and James rode into town together, a small bag of money carefully counted and recounted sitting in Sarah's saddlebag. It was not as much as they needed, even with James's savings added to what Sarah had scraped together, but it was close. They would have to ask for an extension, hope that the banker would be understanding. Mr. Pritchard sat behind his large desk, his expression bland as he counted out the money they had brought. "This is short," he said finally, "by nearly $50. We know," Sarah said, working to keep her voice steady, "but we are asking for a few more weeks. The cattle will be ready to sell soon, and that will more than cover what we still owe." Mr. Pritchard leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "I am afraid I cannot do that, Mrs. Cordell. This payment is already late, and the bank has been more than generous with extensions." "We are not asking for charity," James said, his voice hard. "We are asking for a bit more time to pay what we owe. The ranch is profitable, Mr. Pritchard. You know that as well as anyone. What I know is that you are 2 months behind on your payment, and I have buyers lined up who would pay cash for that property." Mr. Pritchard's smile was cold. "Perhaps it is time to accept that ranching is not for everyone." Sarah felt anger rise in her chest, hot and fierce. "That ranch has been in my family for 20 years. My father built it from nothing, and I will not let you take it just so you can turn around and sell it to one of your rich friends." "I am afraid you do not have much choice," Mr. Pritchard said. "Unless you can come up with the full amount by the end of the week, I will have no choice but to foreclose." They left the bank in a cloud of anger and despair. Sarah felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall, not here in town where people could see. James put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close as they walked toward their horses. "We will figure something out," he said quietly. "I promise you, Sarah, we will not lose the ranch," but Sarah could not see how. They had already sold everything they could spare, had worked themselves to exhaustion trying to make ends meet. $50 might as well have been $5,000 for all the chance they had of coming up with it in a week. That night, Sarah lay awake long after James had fallen asleep beside her. She thought about her father, about all the years he had poured into the ranch, all the sacrifices he had made. She thought about the land itself, the way the light looked at dawn when it spread across the valley, the sound of the wind through the cottonwood trees. She could not lose it. She would not. An idea came to her in the early hours of morning, desperate and dangerous. There was a poker game that ran every week in the back room of the saloon, high stakes, mostly cattlemen and merchants. Sarah had never gambled in her life, but her father had before her mother made him promise to stop. He had been good at it, too, winning more often than he lost. Maybe she had inherited more from him than just his ranch. She slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake James. She dressed quickly and counted out what money they had left, $42, the entirety of their worldly wealth. If she could turn it into $92, they could pay the mortgage and have a little left over. If she lost it, they would have nothing. Sarah made it as far as the barn before James caught up with her, pulling on his boots as he ran. "Where are you going?" he demanded, seeing the determined set of her jaw. "To town," Sarah said. "There is a poker game tonight. If I can win enough, we can pay off the mortgage." "Absolutely not," James said, his voice firm. "Sarah, you cannot risk what little money we have on a card game." "What choice do we have?" Sarah shot back. "We are out of options, James. This is the only way." "Then I will go," James said. "I have played some poker in my time. Let me do this." But Sarah shook her head. "No, this is my fight, my ranch. I have to be the one to save it." James looked at her for a long moment, his jaw working. Finally, he sighed. "Then I am coming with you. If you are going to do this fool thing, I am not letting you do it alone." They rode into town through the darkness, the moon high and bright above them. The saloon was busy, the sound of piano music and laughter spilling out into the street. Sarah tied her horse and took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. "You do not have to do this," James said one last time. "Yes, I do," Sarah said and pushed open the door. The saloon fell quiet as they entered, heads turning to stare at the woman who had just walked into a space that was decidedly male. Sarah ignored the looks and walked straight to the bar, where the owner, a grizzled man named Joe, was pouring drinks. "I am looking for the poker game," Sarah said, pitching her voice to Carrie. Joe raised an eyebrow. "This is not a place for ladies, Mrs. Cordell." "Good thing I am not a lady," Sarah said. "I am a rancher and I have money to play. Is that going to be a problem?" A man at a nearby table laughed, a big sound that filled the room. "Let her play, Joe. Could be entertaining." Joe shrugged. "Your funeral game is in the back room. Buy-in is $10. Sarah pulled the money from her pocket and laid it on the bar. Joe counted it, then jerked his head toward a door at the back of the saloon. Sarah walked through, aware of James following close behind her, his presence a comfort even though her nerves were screaming. The back room was thick with smoke, 5 men sitting around a table covered in green felt. Sarah recognized a few of them. Hank Johnson, who owned the livery, Samuel Gray, a cattle broker, and sitting at the head of the table looking smug and satisfied was Mr. Pritchard himself. "Well, well," Pritchard said as Sarah pulled out a chair and sat down. "Come to lose more money, Mrs. Cordell? Come to win some," Sarah said evenly. She placed her money on the table, feeling every eye in the room on her. James stood behind her chair, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder, a silent show of support. The dealer, a lean man with quick hands, gathered the cards and began to shuffle. "Game is 5-card draw, nothing wild. You know how to play, ma'am." "I know how to play," Sarah said, though her palms were sweating and her heart was racing so fast she thought it might burst from her chest. The cards were dealt. Sarah picked up her hand and forced herself to focus, to remember everything her father had told her about poker in the days before he promised her mother he would quit. "It was not just about the cards you held," he had said. "It was about reading the other players, about knowing when to bet and when to fold, about keeping your face blank so no one could tell what you were thinking." Sarah's first hand was garbage, a nothing collection of cards that had no hope of winning. She folded immediately, watching the play unfold around her. Mr. Pritchard won with a pair of queens, his smile oily as he raked in the pot. The next hand was better, 3 sevens. Sarah bet carefully, not too much, not too little. 2 other players folded, but Pritchard stayed in, raising her bet. Sarah called, her stomach churning. The dealer asked for cards, and Sarah kept all 3 sevens, taking 2 new ones. One was another 7, 4 of a kind. She fought to keep her expression neutral as she bet again. Pritchard studied her, his eyes calculating. "I think you are bluffing," he said and raised. Sarah called, and when they showed their cards, Pritchard's full house lost to her 4 sevens. She pulled the pot toward her, her hands shaking slightly. The game continued, hands blurring together. Sarah won some, lost some, slowly building her stack. Pritchard was getting frustrated. She could see it in the tightness around his eyes, the way he bet more aggressively as the night wore on. James's hand remained steady on her shoulder, grounding her. It was nearing midnight when the biggest hand of the night unfolded. Sarah was dealt a pair of aces and her heart leaped. She bet conservatively, not wanting to scare anyone off. 3 players stayed in, including Pritchard. The draw gave her another ace and 2 random cards, 3 aces. She bet half her remaining stack. 2 players folded immediately, but Pritchard called and raised. Sarah looked at her remaining money. If she called and lost, she would have nothing left. If she won, she would have enough to pay the mortgage with some to spare. "I am all in," Sarah said, pushing all her chips to the center of the table. Pritchard's eyes glittered. "Call," he said, matching her bet. They laid down their cards. Pritchard had a straight king high. Sarah had her 3 aces. The dealer started to push the pot toward her, but Pritchard slammed his hand on the table. "Wait," he said. "I want to see the rest of her hand." Sarah flipped over her final 2 cards. One was a meaningless 4. The other was the 4th ace. The room erupted. James squeezed her shoulder so hard it hurt, but Sarah barely noticed, too busy staring at the mountain of money in front of her. She had won. She had actually won. "That is impossible," Pritchard sputtered, his face red. "She must have cheated." "I saw every card dealt," the dealer said coldly. "The lady won fair and square." Sarah stood on shaking legs and began gathering her winnings. She counted quickly, her hands trembling. $137, more than enough. "Pleasure doing business with you, mister." "Pritchard," Sarah said, unable to keep the satisfaction out of her voice. They left the saloon with James practically carrying her, both of them laughing with relief and disbelief. Outside, under the stars, James picked her up and spun her around, kissing her soundly. "You did it," he said, his voice full of pride. "Sarah, you amazing, brilliant, terrifying woman, you actually did it." "We did it," Sarah corrected. "I could not have done it without you." They rode home through the darkness, the money safely tucked away in Sarah's saddlebag, talking over each other in their excitement. When they finally fell into bed, Sarah was too keyed up to sleep, and James held her close, whispering how proud he was, how brave she had been. "You called my hands brave," Sarah said, remembering that night on the porch weeks ago. "But tonight I felt it. For the first time I actually felt brave." "You have always been brave," James said, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I am just glad you are finally starting to see it yourself." The next morning, they returned to the bank. Mr. Pritchard looked like he had swallowed something sour when they walked through the door, but he could not refuse their payment. Sarah counted out the money with deliberate slowness, enjoying every second of his discomfort. "That clears the mortgage," Pritchard said tightly, handing her a receipt. "You are current for another 3 months. We will see you then," Sarah said sweetly, "with the full payment on time." They walked out of the bank with their heads high, and Sarah felt like she could breathe fully for the first time in months. The ranch was safe. They had time to get back on their feet, to build something sustainable. Most importantly, they had each other. The summer faded into fall, and the ranch thrived under their joint care. They sold the cattle at market for a good price, more than enough to cover the next mortgage payment and buy supplies for winter. James built an addition onto the house, a proper bedroom and a small sitting room, saying that Sarah deserved better than a one-room shack. On a crisp October afternoon, Sarah was working in the garden when she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She barely made it to the edge of the fence before she was sick, her stomach heaving. James found her a few minutes later, pale and shaking, and insisted on putting her to bed despite her protests. "I am fine," Sarah said. "Just something I ate." But the nausea came back the next morning and the morning after that. It took Sarah nearly a week to realize what it meant, and when she did, she felt a rush of emotions so intense she had to sit down. She was pregnant. She and James were going to have a baby. She told him that evening after supper, the words tumbling out in a nervous rush. "I think I am expecting a baby, our baby." James stared at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then his face split into the biggest smile Sarah had ever seen, and he let out a whoop of joy that probably could be heard in town. He picked her up carefully, mindful of her condition now, and kissed her until she was breathless. "We are having a baby," he kept saying like he could not quite believe it. "Sarah, we are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Sarah asked, suddenly nervous. "I know we have not talked about children yet, and money is still tight, and I do not know if we are ready." "Happy does not even begin to cover it," James said, his hands framing her face. "Sarah, you are giving me everything I never dared to dream about. A home, a family, a life filled with love. How could I be anything but thrilled?" Sarah let herself relax into his embrace, letting his joy become her own. They were going to be parents. It was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. Winter came, and with it, the hard work of keeping the ranch running in the cold and snow. Sarah's belly grew round, and James became almost comically protective, refusing to let her lift anything heavy or work too long in the cold. Sarah found it both annoying and endearing, the way he fussed over her, making sure she was warm and fed and rested. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she complained one afternoon when James physically took a bucket of water from her hands. "You are carrying precious cargo," James said, his hand coming to rest on her swollen belly. "The most precious cargo in the world. Let me take care of you, Sarah, please." And Sarah did, learning slowly to accept his care, to let herself be loved and protected. It was still hard, still went against every instinct that told her to be strong and independent. But she was learning that true strength was not in doing everything alone, but in building a life with someone you trusted. The baby came on a warm spring day in 1879, arriving after 14 hours of labor that left Sarah exhausted and elated. James paced the floor the entire time, holding her hand when she needed it, bringing her water, murmuring encouragement. When the midwife finally placed the baby in Sarah's arms, she looked down at the tiny, red, perfect face and felt her heart expand to hold a love she had never known existed. "It is a boy," the midwife announced. "A healthy boy, strong lungs on him." James knelt beside the bed, his eyes shining with tears as he looked at his son. "He is perfect," he whispered. "Sarah, you are amazing, look what you did." They named him Daniel, after Sarah's father, and he became the center of their world. Sarah marveled at his tiny fingers and toes, at the way he gripped her hand when she fed him, at the sound of his cry that could wake her from the deepest sleep. James was a natural father, patient and gentle, singing to Daniel in a low voice that made the baby's eyes go wide and wondering. The ranch continued to prosper. With James's help, Sarah had turned it from a failing homestead into a profitable operation. They bought more cattle, expanded their grazing land, hired a young man from town to help with the heavy work so Sarah could focus on Daniel and the household. Life was not easy, but it was good, filled with the kind of simple joys that Sarah had once thought were not meant for her. On a summer evening, when Daniel was 6 months old, Sarah and James sat on the porch watching the sunset while their son slept peacefully in a cradle James had built with his own hands. Sarah's hands, still rough from work but softer now than they had been a year ago, rested in James's, and she felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. "You remember when I first came here?" James asked, his thumb tracing idle patterns on her palm. "You were so suspicious, so determined not to need anyone." "I was terrified," Sarah admitted. "Of you, of what you represented. The idea of depending on someone again after losing my father, it felt like inviting disaster." "And now?" James asked softly. Sarah turned to look at him, at this man who had become her whole world. "Now I cannot imagine my life without you. You taught me that being strong does not mean being alone, that it is okay to let someone in, to share the burden, to trust that they will not leave." James brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles just as he had done that first time on this very porch. "These hands," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They are still rough from work, still show every scar and callus. But they are the most beautiful hands in the world to me because they represent everything you are, strong, capable, brave." "You always say that," Sarah said, her own voice unsteady. "That I am brave." "Because it is true," James said. "You faced down impossible odds and won. You saved your father's ranch, built a life from nothing but determination and sweat. You brought our son into the world. Sarah, you are the bravest person I know, and I fall more in love with you every single day." Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks, but these were happy tears, tears of gratitude and overwhelming love. "I love you," she said. "More than I ever thought it was possible to love someone." They kissed as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold. From inside the house, Daniel made a small sound in his sleep, and Sarah smiled against James's lips. "We should check on him," she said reluctantly. "In a minute," James said, pulling her closer. "Let me hold you just a little longer." So Sarah stayed, wrapped in her husband's arms, listening to the peaceful sounds of the ranch settling in for the night. She thought about the girl she had been a year and a half ago, standing in the barn doorway, desperate and alone. She thought about all the hard miles she had traveled to get here, to this moment of perfect peace. And she thought about the future, about watching Daniel grow, about building a life and a legacy with the man she loved. The years rolled on, each one bringing new challenges and joys. Daniel grew into a sturdy toddler, then a rambunctious boy, his laughter filling the house. Sarah had 2 more children, a daughter they named Rose and another son they called Thomas. The ranch expanded, becoming one of the most successful operations in the valley. Sarah and James worked side by side through it all, partners in every sense of the word. When Daniel was 10 years old, he asked his mother why her hands looked different from other ladies' hands. Sarah looked down at her work-worn palms, at the scars and calluses that would never quite fade, and smiled. "These hands tell a story," she said, echoing words James had once spoken to her. "They tell the story of how I fought to keep this ranch, of how I met your father, of how I learned that real strength comes from the people who love you and stand beside you." "Papa says you are the bravest person he knows," Daniel said seriously. Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. Even after all these years, James still said those words, still kissed her rough hands and called them brave. "Your papa is biased," she said lightly. "He says you saved his life," Daniel persisted, "that he was lost until he found you." Sarah thought about the day James had ridden up to the ranch, a stranger asking for work. She thought about how he had stayed, how he had loved her with a patience and devotion that had slowly broken down her walls. She thought about the life they had built together, brick by brick, day by day. "We saved each other," Sarah said finally. "That is what love does, Daniel. It makes you stronger, braver, better than you ever could be alone." That evening, after the children were in bed, Sarah and James returned to their favorite spot on the porch. James took her hand as he always did, his fingers lacing through hers, and Sarah marveled at how, after all these years, his touch still made her heart skip. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, reading her mood the way he always could. "About how lucky I am," Sarah said honestly. "There were so many moments when I could have given up, could have sold the ranch and walked away, but I did not, and because of that I found you." "I am the lucky one," James said. "I spent years drifting, never finding a place that felt like home. And then I found you, and suddenly everything made sense." Sarah shifted closer, resting her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever regret it, the life we have chosen? It has not been easy." "Not for a single second," James said without hesitation. "This life with you, raising our children on this land, it is everything I ever wanted. You are everything I ever wanted. Even with my rough hands and my stubborn pride," Sarah teased. James brought her hand to his lips, kissing each knuckle, each finger, each callus with reverent tenderness. "Especially because of your rough hands and stubborn pride," he said. "These hands built our life, Sarah. They are the most precious things in the world to me, second only to the woman they belong to." Sarah turned to kiss him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. Even after 10 years of marriage, 3 children and countless challenges overcome, James still had the power to make her feel cherished and valued. He still saw her, really saw her, in a way no one else ever had. As the stars came out one by one overhead, Sarah thought about the long road that had brought her to this moment. The grief and fear, the backbreaking work, the desperate gamble in the saloon, the terrifying joy of becoming a mother. Every hardship, every triumph had been worth it to arrive here, to this place of contentment and love. "Tell me again," she whispered against James's lips. "Tell you what," he murmured, though he knew exactly what she wanted to hear. "Tell me I am brave." James cupped her face in his hands, his eyes blazing with love and pride. "You are the bravest woman I have ever known, Sarah Cordell. You have been brave since the day I met you, and you will be brave until your last breath. And I will spend the rest of my life thanking God that you let me be brave with you." Sarah kissed him again, her rough hands tangling in his hair, and knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world. Not just in this ranch or this land, but in the circle of her husband's arms, in the love they had built together through hardship and joy. The children grew, the ranch prospered, And Sarah and James grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. On warm summer evenings, they could often be found sitting on the porch, hands clasped, watching the sun set over the land they had fought so hard to keep. And always, without fail, James would lift Sarah's hand to his lips and kiss each rough finger, calling them brave, calling them beautiful, calling them home. When Daniel was 23 and ready to take over running the ranch, when Rose was preparing for her wedding, and Thomas was talking about going to college to study law, Sarah and James sat together in the sitting room they had built so many years ago and reflected on the life they had made. "We did all right, did we not?" Sarah said, her head resting on James's shoulder, their fingers interlaced as they had been 1,000 times before. "Better than all right," James said. "We built something that will last, Sarah, not just this ranch, but a legacy of love and hard work and courage. Our children know what it means to fight for what matters, to stand by the people they love, to be brave even when they are scared." "They learned that from watching you," Sarah said. "They learned it from watching both of us," James corrected. "From watching their mother refuse to give up, refuse to be beaten down, refuse to accept anything less than the life she wanted. You taught them that, Sarah. You showed them what real strength looks like." Sarah looked down at their joined hands, at her fingers still rough despite years of prosperity that had allowed her to hire help for the hardest work. Some scars never faded, she thought, but that was all right. They were proof of where she had been, what she had overcome, who she had become. "Do you remember the first time you kissed my hands?" she asked, her voice soft with memory. "That night on the porch when you told me I was brave." "I remember every detail," James said. "You were crying, really crying, for the first time since I had known you. And I wanted to tell you that everything you had been through, every scar and callus was proof of your courage. So I kissed your hands and told you they were brave because they were, because you are." "I did not believe you then," Sarah admitted. "I thought I was just surviving, doing what had to be done." "And now?" James asked, tilting her chin up so he could look into her eyes. "Now I know you were right," Sarah said. "It was brave, all of it, accepting your help, letting myself love you, building a family, fighting for this place. I was brave, even when I did not feel like it." James kissed her, slow and sweet, and Sarah felt the familiar warmth spread through her chest. After 25 years of marriage, his kiss still made her feel like a girl again, young and full of hope. "I love you, Sarah Cordell," James whispered against her lips. "I have loved you since the day I rode up to a dusty barn and saw a stubborn young woman covered in grime and determination, and I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," Sarah whispered back. "You gave me everything I thought I had lost. Hope, joy, love, a future. You saw me when I felt invisible, valued me when I felt worthless. You taught me that I was not alone, and that made all the difference." They sat together as the afternoon faded into evening, talking about their children and grandchildren, about the ranch, and all the changes they had seen over the years. They talked about the future, about the dreams they still had left to fulfill. And when the sun finally set and the house grew dark around them, they climbed the stairs to their bedroom, still hand in hand, still partners in everything. That night, as Sarah lay in bed with James's arms around her, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the gunshot that killed her father to this moment of perfect peace, it had been a long and difficult road. But she would not change any of it, would not wish away a single hardship, because each one had been necessary to bring her to this place, to this man, to this life. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah felt James kiss her forehead, then her cheek, then take her hand and press his lips to her palm, her knuckles, each finger in turn. Even half asleep, she smiled, recognizing the familiar gesture. "Brave," she heard him whisper in the darkness. "My brave, beautiful, perfect Sarah." And Sarah, surrounded by love, by the evidence of a life well lived, by the certain knowledge that she was cherished and valued, finally, completely believed him. Years continued to pass in the comfortable rhythm of a life well built. The ranch changed hands officially when Daniel turned 25, though Sarah and James remained involved, offering advice and helping where they could. They watched their daughter Rose marry a good man, a schoolteacher from Cheyenne who adored her and made her laugh. They celebrated when Thomas came home with his law degree and announced he was opening a practice in Sweetwater Creek, determined to help people like his mother who had struggled against an unfair system. Sarah and James became grandparents 5 times over, their house once again filled with the sound of children's laughter. They spoiled the little ones shamelessly, telling them stories of the old days, of how Grandma Sarah had saved the ranch with a poker game, of how Grandpa James had appeared one morning like a guardian angel in dusty boots. On their 30th wedding anniversary, James planned a surprise. He arranged for Daniel and Rose to watch over the ranch for a week, and he took Sarah on the journey she had dreamed about so many years ago. They traveled by train to California, to the coast, to the endless expanse of ocean that Sarah had only read about in books. Sarah stood on the beach with her shoes off and her feet in the sand, staring at the vast blue water that stretched to the horizon. Tears streamed down her face as she watched the waves roll in, as she listened to their constant roar, as she breathed in the salt air. James stood beside her, his arm around her waist, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, her voice nearly lost in the sound of the surf. "Thank you for remembering, for making this happen." "I remember everything you have ever told me," James said. "Every dream, every hope, every fear. And I want to spend whatever time we have left making as many of those dreams come true as I can." They stayed on the coast for 5 days, walking the beach, watching the sunset over the water, marveling at the pelicans and seals and the sheer, impossible vastness of the ocean. On their last evening, as they stood on a cliff overlooking the sea, James took Sarah's hand and kissed it, a gesture so familiar and beloved that Sarah felt her heart might burst. "These hands have touched so much," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "They have built and fought and loved. They have brought children into the world, saved a ranch, dealt winning cards, held me when I needed holding. These brave, beautiful hands." "They are just hands," Sarah said, but she was smiling, her eyes shining with tears. "No," James said firmly. "They are the hands of the woman I love, and there is nothing just about them. They are extraordinary, like the woman they belong to." Sarah kissed him there on the cliff, with the ocean roaring below them and the sun setting in a blaze of glory, and she thought that this was happiness. Not the absence of struggle or pain, but the presence of love so deep and true that it made every hardship worthwhile. They returned to Wyoming, to the ranch, to the life they had built. The seasons turned, children grew, and Sarah and James moved deeper into the comfortable companionship of a long marriage. They knew each other's rhythms now, could communicate with just a look, finished each other's sentences without thinking about it. They bickered good-naturedly about small things and stood united on the big ones, a team in every sense of the word. When Sarah was 53, she fell sick with pneumonia. The doctor came from town and shook his head gravely, saying it would be a near thing. James never left her side, sitting beside her bed day and night, spooning broth into her mouth when she was strong enough to take it, bathing her forehead with cool cloths when the fever raged. He held her hand constantly, his lips moving in silent prayer. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes seeing James clearly, sometimes seeing him as he had been when they first met, young and strong and hopeful. In her delirium, she relived their first kiss, their wedding day, the births of their children. She heard James's voice, steady and sure, telling her she was brave, that she had to fight, that he needed her. "Cannot leave me yet, Sarah," she heard him say through the fog. "We have more years to spend together, more dreams to chase. You are the bravest woman I know, and brave women do not give up. Come back to me, love. Please come back." And Sarah, somewhere in the darkness, heard him and fought her way back to the light. The fever broke on the 5th day, and when she opened her eyes, it was to find James slumped in the chair beside her bed, his hand still clutching hers, his face haggard with exhaustion and worry. "James," she whispered, her voice a broken rasp. His eyes flew open, and when he saw she was awake, truly awake, he burst into tears. He pressed his face to her hand, his shoulders shaking with sobs of relief. "You came back," he kept saying. "Thank God you came back." "Of course I did," Sarah said weakly. "Could not leave you, not yet." "We still have the ocean to visit again, remember?" James laughed through his tears and leaned in to kiss her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "We will go back next year," he promised. "And the year after that, and the year after that. We will go every year until we are too old to travel, and then we will sit on our porch and remember." Sarah recovered slowly, her strength returning bit by bit. James fussed over her like a mother hen, refusing to let her do any work until the doctor pronounced her fully healed. Their children visited often, bringing the grandchildren who climbed carefully into bed with Grandma Sarah and listened to her stories. One afternoon, when Sarah was well enough to sit on the porch again, Rose came to visit with her youngest daughter, a bright-eyed girl of 7 named Sarah in honor of her grandmother. Little Sarah climbed into her namesake's lap and took her grandmother's hand, studying it with a child's unfiltered curiosity. "Your hands are funny, Grandma," she said. "They are all bumpy and rough." "Sarah," Rose scolded, but Sarah Mitchell just laughed. "It is all right," she said. "You are right, little one. My hands are rough. They have been this way for a very long time." "Why?" the child asked. Sarah looked down at her granddaughter, at this little girl who would grow up in a world of opportunity that Sarah could hardly have imagined at her age. "Because I worked very hard when I was young," she explained. "I had a ranch to save, and that meant doing jobs that were difficult and made my hands tough." "Did it hurt?" little Sarah asked, her eyes wide. "Sometimes," Sarah admitted, "but it was worth it. Because of these hands, I saved my home. I met your grandfather. I built the life that gave me your mother and your uncles and all you beautiful grandchildren." "Grandpa says you are brave," the girl said. "He says you are the bravest person in the whole world." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. After all these years, James still said those words, still believed them with his whole heart. "Your grandfather is very kind," she said gently. James appeared at that moment, coming around the corner of the house with an armful of firewood. He stopped when he saw them, and his face softened into a smile. "Talking about me?" he asked, pretending to be suspicious. "Little Sarah says you think I am brave," Sarah said, her eyes meeting her husband's. James set down the wood and came to stand beside them, his hand resting on Sarah's shoulder. "I do not think it," he said. "I know it. Your grandmother is the bravest, strongest, most remarkable woman I have ever known, and I thank God every day that she let me share her life." He lifted Sarah's hand from where it rested on their granddaughter's shoulder and kissed it, a gesture so automatic and natural that he probably did not even realize he was doing it. But little Sarah noticed, her eyes going round. "You kiss Grandma's hands?" she asked. "Every chance I get," James said seriously. "Because these are not just any hands. These are brave hands, hands that built our family, hands that I have had the privilege of holding for more than 30 years. Little Sarah looked between them, sensing something important even if she did not fully understand it. "When I grow up, I want to be brave like Grandma," she announced. Sarah felt tears well up, the good kind, the kind that came from being so full of love you could not contain it all. "You will be," she promised. "You will be brave and strong and kind, and you will build a life that makes you happy." That evening, after Rose and little Sarah had gone home, Sarah and James sat on the porch in their customary spot. The sun was setting, painting the sky in the brilliant colors they had watched together hundreds of times. James held Sarah's hand, his thumb tracing the familiar landscape of her knuckles. "Do you ever wish things had been different?" Sarah asked quietly. "That life had been easier." James considered the question seriously. "No," he finally said. "If life had been easier, you would not be the woman you are, and it is this woman, this brave, stubborn, magnificent woman that I fell in love with. I would not change a single thing. Not even the hard parts?" Sarah pressed. The fear, the struggle, almost losing the ranch, especially not the hard parts, James said. Because those are the parts that showed me who you really are. Those are the parts that made our joy so much sweeter. We earned this life, Sarah. We fought for it and bled for it and never gave up. That makes it all the more precious. Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid weight of him beside her, the steady beat of his heart. I love you, she said simply. More than anything, more than anyone, I love you. And I love you, James replied. Until my last breath, and beyond that if such things are possible, I love you. They sat together as the stars came out, as they had done thousands of times before and would do thousands of times again. And in that perfect moment, Sarah felt the truth of their life together settle over her like a warm blanket. They had built something real and lasting, something that would endure through their children and grandchildren and beyond. They had taken fear and struggle and turned it into love and hope. Her hands might be rough, scarred by years of hard labor and hardship. But they were also the hands that had built this life, that had held her children, that had clasped her husbands in partnership and love. They were brave hands, just as James had always said. And she, Sarah Cordell, was brave too. Not because she had never been afraid, but because she had been afraid and done what needed doing anyway. Not because she had never needed help, but because she had learned to accept it with grace. Not because life had been easy, but because she had faced the hard times with courage and come out stronger on the other side. As the years continued to roll on, Sarah and James settled into the gentle rhythm of their later years. They took one more trip to the ocean when Sarah was 57, walking the same beach, marveling once again at the endless water. They celebrated their 40th anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren, the house overflowing with love and laughter. When James was 69, he passed away peacefully in his sleep, his hand clasped in Sarah's. Sarah held him as his breathing slowed and stopped, as the man who had been her partner, her love, her everything, left her for the last time. She pressed her rough, scarred hand to his cheek and whispered goodbye, her tears falling freely. The grief was overwhelming, a physical weight that pressed on her chest and made it hard to breathe. But Sarah was brave, just as James had always said. She mourned him, deeply and truly, but she did not break. She stood at his grave and spoke of love that transcended death, of partnership that had spanned 4 decades, of a life well lived and well loved. And on quiet evenings, when Sarah sat alone on the porch watching the sunset, she would look down at her hands, still rough after all these years, and remember the way James used to kiss them. She would remember his voice saying brave, his eyes full of love and pride. She would remember every moment of their life together, every joy and sorrow, every triumph and challenge. Sarah lived another 8 years after James's death, surrounded by family, content in the legacy they had built together. When she finally joined him, passing peacefully at the age of 78, the whole town came to her funeral. They spoke of her courage, her determination, her unwavering love for the land and the man who had helped her save it. Daniel, speaking at his mother's grave, held up his own work-roughened hands. My mother taught me that bravery is not the absence of fear, he said, his voice carrying across the assembled mourners. It is feeling the fear and doing what needs to be done anyway. She taught me that strength comes from the people who stand beside you, who love you through the hard times. And she taught me that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. He paused, looking down at the casket that would be lowered beside James's, reuniting them at last. My father used to kiss my mother's hands, he said, his voice breaking slightly. He would call them brave and she would protest, but he was right. Those hands built our home, our family, our legacy. Those hands were brave, and the woman they belonged to was the bravest of all. Sarah was buried beside James, their headstones simple but eloquent, hers read, Sarah Mitchell Cordell, 1858 to 1936, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother, she was brave. And beneath it, added by her children, her hands built a legacy of love. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through generations, each one adding their own chapter to the story. And always, the tale was told of how Sarah Mitchell had saved it in 1878, how a young woman with rough hands and an iron will had refused to give up, how she had met a cowboy who saw her courage and called it beautiful. And sometimes, on summer evenings when the light was just right, descendants swore they could see two figures sitting on the old porch, hands clasped, watching the sunset together. Just shadows, perhaps, or tricks of the light. Or maybe it was Sarah and James, still together, still in love, still partners in eternity as they had been in life. The story of the rough hands and the cowboy who kissed them became family legend, passed down with love and pride. It was a story of courage and love, of hardship overcome and dreams achieved. It was a story of two people who found each other when they needed it most and built something that lasted far beyond their own lives. And at the heart of it all were those hands, rough from years of hard labor, scarred by struggle and toil. Hands that had been kissed by a man who saw in them everything beautiful and brave about the woman he loved. Hands that had built a legacy of love that would endure for generations to come. It was a love story for the ages, born in the harsh landscape of the 1878 Wyoming Territory, forged in struggle and hardship, and perfected through decades of partnership and devotion. It was the story of her hands were rough from years of hard labor. The cowboy kissed each one and called them brave. And it was, in the end, a story of how love can transform us, how it can take our deepest wounds and turn them into badges of honor, how it can make the weakest among us strong and the strongest among us vulnerable. It was a story of how two people, against all odds, built a life worth living and a love worth remembering. The ranch still stands today, more than a century later, testament to Sarah's courage and James's devotion. The house has been expanded and modernized, but the original structure remains, including that porch where they spent so many evenings together. And sometimes, when the current residents sit out there watching the sunset, they think about the young woman with rough hands who refused to give up, and the cowboy who saw her bravery and loved her for it. It is a story that reminds us all that true love sees beyond the surface, that it values the scars and calluses that come from a life fully lived. It reminds us that bravery comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is accept help from someone who wants to stand beside us. It reminds us that the strongest partnerships are built not in ease but in struggle, not in perfection but in acceptance of each other's flaws. Sarah and James's love story became more than just family legend. It became a touchstone, a reminder of what was possible when two people committed fully to each other and to building something lasting. Their descendants told the story at weddings and anniversaries, to children struggling with their own challenges, to anyone who needed reminding that love and courage could overcome almost anything. The story of the rough hands lived on, inspiring generation after generation. It reminded young women that their worth was not measured by soft hands and pretty dresses, but by their character and courage. It reminded young men that true strength was found in lifting others up, in seeing and valuing the bravery of those around them. It reminded everyone that love was not about perfection, but about accepting and celebrating each other completely, scars and all. And so the legend grew, taking on a life of its own, becoming more than just the story of two people but a testament to the enduring power of love and courage. Sarah Mitchell Cordell and James Cordell became symbols of everything good and true about the American West, about the pioneers who built something from nothing, about the love that sustained them through impossible odds. But at its heart, it remained a simple story. A story of a young woman with rough hands and a cowboy who kissed them. A story of love found in the most unlikely of circumstances. A story of bravery recognized and celebrated. A story of two people who built a life together that was worth the struggle, worth the pain, worth everything it cost them to achieve. It was, in the end, a love story. the best kind of love story. The kind that reminds us all that we are capable of more than we think, that we are braver than we know, and that sometimes the greatest adventure is simply opening our hearts to another person and building a life together, one rough-handed day at a time. And if you listen carefully on quiet Wyoming evenings, when the wind whispers through the valley and the sun paints the sky in shades of orange and gold, you might just hear an echo of James's voice carried on the breeze, saying those 3 words that defined a lifetime of love. You are brave. And you might feel the presence of Sarah, rough hands folded in contentment, finally believing him, finally seeing herself as he always saw her, courageous, remarkable, beloved. Their story ended as all stories must, but their legacy lived on. In the ranch that still stood proud on the land Sarah had fought to save. In the descendants who carried their names and their values forward. In the tale told and retold of rough hands and the cowboy who called them brave. And most of all, in the reminder they left behind that true love sees us at our worst and calls us our best. That bravery is not the absence of fear but the choice to keep going despite it, and that some partnerships are so strong, so true, that they echo through eternity. The end.